Hi, I'm John Nunn, and in this group of videos I'm going to talk about some of the bestsellers which we published in previous years. So I'm starting with one of my own books, Understanding Chess Move by Move, which was published in 2001, so it's over 20 years old now, but it still sells well and has proven one of Gambit's best-selling titles over the intervening decades. I'd just like to talk about why I wrote the book in the first place. The idea was to produce a book which would show some modern top Grandmaster games and explain how contemporary chess is played. Chess these days is very different to the chess which was played, say, in the 19th century. People are much more sophisticated, players don't make so many elementary mistakes, and all in all, it's just a more complicated game now than it was before. This book is aimed at club players, and it employs the concept of giving an annotation to every move, apart from obvious recaptures, for example. It wasn't an original concept. There was a book called Logical Chess Move by Move by the American author Irving Chernev, which was published a long time ago. And after Understanding Chess Move by Move, there was a whole spate of move by move books by other publishers, so it's clearly a concept that has its place in chess literature. I'm going to show you one game which I particularly liked and which I included in the book, so let's take a look at that. It's the game between John van der Wiel and Rafael Varganian, two strong grandmasters of the 1990s, played in 1993. Both players very sharp and aggressive, so we can expect some real fireworks in this game. White started with e4, and Varganian continued with an opening which was one of his favourites. He also played the French defence quite a lot. He still occasionally plays these days in senior events, in fact. This opening, Alekhine defence, is one of the most direct attempts by black to conduct the opening. He immediately attacks the white e-pawn with his knight and tempts white to push the pawn on and drive the knight away. White advances his other centre pawn so as to get his pieces into play, and black starts to challenge the white centre by attacking the pawn on e5. There are quite a range of options here for white. Well, the simplest is to just develop normally, knight to f3. It's modest, but probably theoretically the best continuation. But there are certainly other possibilities, and van der Wiel goes for one of the most aggressive, the so-called four pawns attack. First he pushes the c-pawn to drive the knight away, and then he pushes the f-pawn. And you can see how this variation got its name. White spends a lot of time establishing this massive pawn centre, but as so often happens in chess, an advantage comes with a corresponding disadvantage. The advantage here is that white gains space in the centre. The disadvantage is that he spends a lot of time moving his pawns and is likely to fall behind in development. So that's the way chess is these days, one advantage against another, and the result of the game will often be decided by the player whose advantage proves most relevant in the subsequent play. So it's not just a case of, like in the old days, one player just neglects his development and gets roundly crushed. White is neglecting his development here, but he is getting a corresponding advantage, and if he can consolidate his pawn centre, he's going to have a definite positional superiority. Black has to play quickly to attack the pawn centre, so he swaps pawns and immediately brings his knight out to attack the pawn on d4. Now there's a mistake here which is often played by people who are unfamiliar with the opening, and that's to defend the pawn with the knight. You shouldn't play this move. Black brings his bishop out, prepares to exchange the knight and pins it, and now suddenly this pawn on d4 is extremely weak. So it's a big mistake to defend the pawn on d4 with the knight. Instead it's better to play as van der Wiel did, bishop to e3. White is going to wait to develop this knight until black has committed his bishop to f5. then if the bishop wants to go to g4, it has to waste a move. So bishop does in fact go to f5. White brings his other knight out. The pawn moves forward to open the diagonal for bishop development, and now the knight comes to f3. Here there are several options for black. One of the simplest is just to develop with the bishop followed by castles and then f6, undermining the white pawn centre. That's a good solid option. But Vaganian does something more double-edged. He does in fact move his bishop to g4. He says, I don't mind wasting a tempo if I'm going to get rid of that important knight which defends the critical pawn on d4, which is the foundation of white's centre. Van der Wiel simply developed his bishop as the most natural move, and black swapped off. White can't take now with the bishop because it leaves the pawn on c4 hanging, so he has to take with the pawn. And now black played his queen to d7. He wants to bring his rook to d8 one way or another to again threaten the pawn on d4. Now this is a really critical moment in the game. White has to decide how he's going to counter this threat, and Van der Wiel made a mistake. The reason why it's a mistake turns out to be quite subtle. So let's just see what the correct move is. The correct move would be to move the queen to d2 or possibly to d3 and then to castle queenside, bringing the rook into play and providing an additional support for the pawn on d4. In this case, white would very likely have the advantage. It's not quite clear how black is going to undermine the white pawn centre. What he actually played was he pushed his f-pawn, which has a nice visual appearance. The pawns are again in a kind of line abreast formation. It looks very solid, but it does spend another move on something that doesn't develop a piece. And he probably thought that he had black's pressure against d4 adequately countered, but Vaganian's next move shows that that is not the case. And the move black played was quite surprising. He played rook d8. Now of course beginners are always told, yeah, use your castle, get your king to safety as soon as possible, and yet here Vaganian doesn't castle, instead he just moves his rook and leaves his king in the centre. Now the reason for this turns out to be quite subtle. When annotating chess games, I'm always reminded of what Albert Einstein is alleged to have said, namely that you should make things as simple as possible but not simpler. Sometimes when you're explaining chess moves, you can do it in terms of general principles and without going into too much detail, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the move does depend on concrete analysis, and then there's no way to avoid it. You just have to give it if you're going to be honest about why the move was played. So let's see what happens if, in fact, black plays castles. Then white has this tactical line. First he attacks the knight goes into the centre, white swaps, queen takes, bishop attacks queen, queen drops back. Now there's a threefold attack on d4 and no obvious way to defend the pawn, but here comes the tactical point. White pushes his pawn to d5, and if black doesn't take it, the pawn probably will go on to d6 and drive a tremendous wedge into black's position. If black takes, white plays his bishop to g4, pinning and winning the enemy queen. So that's why black doesn't castle. It would put his king and queen on the same diagonal in this variation and allow white this tactical method of removing the pressure against his central pawns. So it's likely that this rook d8 move, which avoids the geometric lineup of king and queen, came as a bit of a surprise to Van der Wiel. And now the d pawn is attacked, no obvious way to defend it. The line with c5 we just looked at doesn't work anymore. So Van der Wiel went for another option. He decided to just push the pawn, which of course removes the pressure against d4, but unfortunately replaces it with pressure against d5 instead. Well, black can in fact take this pawn like this, takes, but this actually would be bad because white now would attack the black queen, threatening incidentally to take it with check. the queen has no way to stay defending the knight on d5. So greedily taking the pawn on d5 would be a mistake. Now it's interesting to note that white is actually threatening to win a piece here. If black plays a nothing move, white wins a piece as follows. He takes on b6, he takes on c6, black takes with the queen, attacking the white queen and the rook on h1. But now queen here pins the black queen, queen can no longer take it on h1 and white wins a piece. So there is actually a threat when white pushes his pawn, but black found a very clever way to meet that. He developed his bishop. It's nice to play a developing move that meets your opponent's threats at the same time. White went ahead with the capture on b6, which was probably a mistake because the e3 bishop is an important defensive piece. White instead most likely should have just castled or maybe even played king f2, which actually does lose a pawn on d5, but white with his two bishops would get some compensation for it. Instead, white played to preserve his pawn on d5, but without this bishop, the white king in the centre of the board becomes terribly exposed. Black, of course, recaptured. And now taking on c6 no longer works, because after this move, the knight is pinned and doesn't actually defend the queen. So white would lose his queen. So Van der Wiel was reduced to playing this move in order to avoid losing a pawn on d5 immediately. Black swapped off and queen came to an active square on h3, stopping white castling and retaining the pin on the pawn on d5. Now it's obvious that white's strategy has failed. Position has become quite open now. White is well behind in development. Black has 4 pieces in really aggressive positions. White has only 2 pieces not on their original squares, and one of them is pinned and not much use. The white king is very exposed in the centre of the board, and indeed there's an immediate threat for black to check here and then take the pawn on f4. Well, white was now reduced to this rather unnatural grovelling defence of moving his king, and black, as the text says, was able to rub salt in the wound by simply castling, bringing his last piece into play and emphasising the fact that white's position is seriously compromised. He has spent too much time on pawn moves and not enough on developing his pieces. White now plays queen d3. Black has actually various really strong options here. Verganian chose one of the simplest. It's probably something quicker, but it doesn't really matter. The knight now drops back to e7. It's going to g6 to target the weak pawn on f4, where incidentally it would have fought with the king and queen. White moved his queen out of the way and attacked the black bishop. Black doesn't want to waste time moving the bishop, so he swaps off. Well, there's quite a few strong moves here, but Verganian chooses a very elegant way to decisively improve his position. He wants to open the d-file so that his rook can get to grips with the exposed white king, and he does so with this pawn sacrifice. White has nothing better than to take, and now with gain of time, black attacks the queen and ensures the exchange of the pawn on d5 so as to open the d-file for his rook. If white takes on b7, black just takes here, threatening f4 and c3, and after this exchange it's queen and rook against the king with 0 defensive pieces, and that can only end one way. So instead white took and black took back, again gaining time by attacking the queen. Queen retreated to defend f4, and now the knight comes to g6, threatening to play the queen to either h4 or f5, with deadly pressure against the f4 pawn. Van der Wiel found a rather artificial way to defend the pawn from the side by using his rook, but the black queen now has an entry into the white position. It's interesting to note that if the king goes to f1, black can win quite nicely with this temporary sacrifice, forking king and rook, and after the queen takes the rook, black is simply a piece ahead. So the king had to go forwards. Another check forces the king right into the centre of the board. Now black has various ways to win. He can play king h8 and then f5 check. Now the pawn is unpinned. That may be the quickest, but what Vaganian played achieves the same thing in a similar way. It unpins the pawn on f5 by putting the rook on the same diagonal as the queen, and now there's a deadly threat of, for example, if white plays this, f5 check takes rook here and it's checkmate. There's actually no good way to prevent this f5 check threat, so Van der Wiel resigned at this point. It was a wonderfully energetic game by Vaganian, and a good example of what I wanted to demonstrate in the book, which is that people don't make these mistakes of not developing without some compensating advantage. Here white was playing for a space advantage in the big centre, black was playing for active piece play and pressure against the centre. If white had played accurately and not wasted time playing f4 for the second time, it may well be that white would have won this battle of advantages. But the way he played it, it only required one slight inaccuracy for the game to shift round completely and for black's leading development to be the dominant feature of the game. Well, thank you for listening to my video, and I look forward to seeing you for the next one.